Hello, everyone, and welcome to EPG Talks, the podcast of the Energy Policy Group. For those listeners that don't know, Energy Policy Group is a think tank based in Bucharest, Romania, and specializing in energy and climate policy. In this episode today, we're going to talk about industry and the need to transform industry in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Europe more broadly. And with us today, we have Aleksander Śniegocki, one of the perfect people to talk about this. Aleksander is the founder and current CEO of the Reform Institute, which is a think tank in Poland that works on issues of the energy transition and decarbonization of economies in Poland and Central and Eastern Europe. So, Aleksander, welcome to the podcast. Just to set the scene a little bit with you, Aleksander, I wanted to start with maybe a little bit of a broader question, which is, why are we talking about industry? Which is a discussion that's happening more and more at European level, at national level. We're hearing a lot of various policies coming out to support the transformation of industry. And when we talk about industry, we're talking about heavy industry, like steel manufacturing, concrete, but also more downstream industries like the automotive sector, which has been in the spotlight as well recently. So just to kick us off, why is industry important and why are we talking about it in the context of Central and Eastern Europe?
Yes, thank you for having me, and indeed, this is a very timely discussion. But I think actually the topic of industrial policy repeats itself every 5 or 10 years in Europe, and indeed, this is an important part both from the economic and security and also social point of view. So. Historically, especially manufacturing industry was a very important driver of economic growth, progress. So it was the place where the actual progress was happening. So material progress, our capacity to produce more to fill the needs, and the way in which you were productive, competitive in manufacturing industry, the way in which you could export and especially higher quality products to other markets also affected you very significantly when it comes to your overall incomes, quality of jobs. Over years, as the manufacturing sector basically increased its productivity, it also limited its share of GDP, as very similar way as a few decades back agriculture did. But still, compared to agriculture, it's still the goods, the production of stuff is very important. It's still around 20% in our part of Europe. And it's not going to converge to a few percent anytime soon. And so from economic perspective, you want to have a diverse manufacturing base, you want to have capacity to innovate, and for that you also need local manufacturing base, because you can't just develop new products in the lab and just on a very abstract way. You need actual industrial plants to test, to implement these innovations, to deploy new technologies, which also contributes to, as I already mentioned, quality jobs in manufacturing and around it. So this is the economic aspect. You also have a security aspect, especially given that in recent years we have all seen increasing vulnerability of international global supply chains, increased tensions on a global level, and increased recognition that you also need at least some strategic reserves when it comes to manufacturing base for basic materials, for instance. Yes, you would like to have at least some steel capacity production or other basic materials or technologies which you use then to produce vehicles. But also in recent years, we have seen that also military sector still needs manufacturing base to actually deliver when it's needed. And in previous years, it was also, for instance, medical supplies. So it's still very useful and it's still very important to have appropriate manufacturing base to produce stuff, even though obviously there were also some gains, very important gains from international cooperation, trade, and globalization. But recent years have shown that you also have to think in terms of reducing vulnerabilities and investing also at least in your part of the world, so that when the crisis strikes, the shock strikes, you have capacity to react. So this applies both to technologies, more which you mentioned, clean technologies, for instance, but also to this more heavy industries which produce basic materials. And this is also a way in which, for instance, now Clean Industrial Deal is structured, that you have basically these two main tracks, developing new technologies, strengthening the base of suppliers who deliver solutions which allow to decarbonize, to shift away from fossil fuels on one hand, and then also to help transform existing industries, which is also a very significant challenge for them, given that the energy costs and emission costs are a significant part of their overall cost structure. So they're very vulnerable to any shifts in this costs of inputs, costs of emissions.
Yeah, lots to unpick there. And I think I wanted to come back to one thing that you were mentioning, which is this idea of self-sufficiency, which has really been the word of the day since, especially since the Draghi report came out last summer, which was really highlighting how Europe has to make some significant strides to sort of reclaim a position in terms of its competitiveness. So I'm wondering, starting with the Draghi report and now sort of looking towards the recent policies that we've had coming out, and also maybe to what's due to come out soon. So we've just had the Clean Industrial Deal a few days ago, and we're also due to have an Affordable Energy Action Plan, various roadmaps for European industry. So which of these do you see, which of these strike you as having a particular impact on Central and Eastern Europe, which as a region is more dependent on industry economically, as you were mentioning, than other parts of Europe? It still represents a higher share of gross value added, a higher share of employment, and it has been dwindling as well. So it's been facing challenges ever since the end of the communist regime, and now it's at a bit of a crossroads. So in terms of what's coming out of EU policy, how do you see this impacting Central and Eastern Europe? And are there any considerations that need to be taken into account given the specificities of Central and Eastern Europe as a region?
Yes, it's a great question. And I think indeed we should start with Draghi report and overall discussion on competitiveness. So it's also something which happens every 10, 15 years. You can actually go back 30 years and read very similar narratives on Europe losing competitiveness to US, for instance, and very, very similar suggestions how to move forward. So obviously the question would be why we're not moving forward in many cases. And I think that the answer would be actually not related to energy and climate policy, as sometimes is in the discussions. And here I'll just take a small detour to the overall economic policy. So the Draghi report actually very explicitly states that Europe has several problems with innovation, with overall regulatory regime as such, or with problems with integration of single market. And these are cross-cutting issues, not necessarily sectoral. So it's not that green policies lead to decline in competitiveness, but rather that cross-cutting policies which negatively affect competitiveness, or as I would prefer to say, productivity, capacities of Europe to actually deliver new companies, to scale up businesses, to deliver investments, they actually make it harder for us to meet our environmental, security goals, social goals. And this is like very, very clearly stated in Draghi report. The chain goes from your capacities, from economic capacities to your ability to meet the for instance, industrial decarbonization goals, and not the other way around, which I think is in many cases lost in debate. So when the discussion is about what we need to do, I think too many people treat it as like we need to cut green commitments or we need to cut social commitments. When in fact you have problems also noted by Draghi report when it comes to, yes, I would say overregulation, but not when it comes to emission standards, for instance, but when it comes to how difficult it is to start the business or scale up a small business from one country to another in Europe, for instance, or how the capital markets, for instance, work in Europe, and how, once again, it's difficult to raise capital to scale up. And I think in recent years, this climate energy policy was to some extent maybe blamed too much, or just in the wrong direction, actually, when it comes to decreasing competitiveness of Europe. Because once again, if you look at Draghi report, in clean tech, Europe is not doing that bad compared to China and US. If you look at other types of sectors, other types of technologies, our challenges in clean tech are not as large, as big as in ICT, for instance, or AI. And that is also thanks to our approaches in the past years, which promoted green markets, and some of them are also continued in what the Commission proposes today. So this is just to say that the whole framework, how we think about clean industrial deal or overall political moment in Europe today, I think we need to be very clear that you have cross-cutting European economic policy goals, which have nothing to do with specific industrial decarbonization policies. And then you have several things which can be improved in industrial decarbonization, which to significant extent were mentioned in Draghi report and which now we have seen in Green Industrial Deal. With, once again, some cross-cutting, those still present. So I'm thinking about the financing. So on the side of coordinating existing funds, supporting member states in, for instance, accelerating permitting procedures or revising their tariff structure to make electricity for industry more affordable. This is something which the European Commission has mandate to do, and it's trying to do this. But in the end, if there is no commitment from the member states to pool the resources and provide a European level funding, new European funding already, and not in the next MFF, so multi-annual financial framework, then it means that it will be more difficult to actually have efficient, effective European level action, and you will have still fragmented support from on the national level. And this is why you're asking about CE perspective, CE challenge. I think that this is one of the main challenges, that it's still not European level enough when it comes to resources, which doesn't necessarily mean that we can't do anything, because still there are some resources on national level, like from ETS revenues, or you can also repurpose some of the European funds, existing European funds, but still you don't have any mechanism which ensures that the money which we spend on industrial decarbonization on the European level is going to be actually flowing to the places where it's most efficient, most effective. And we are likely to see the repeat of situation when few countries with not only fiscal capacity, but also administrative planning capacity have moved forward, while our part of Europe struggles to keep up. Once again, not only because of purely financial issues, but also because you need this kind of planning, you need this kind of coordination and forward-looking approach when it comes to delivering this infrastructure for decarbonizing industry. Mm, and if you look at previous years, it looks challenging for our governments and now part of Europe to move forward with this. But it's also a positive side that it's still within our choice, yes, as countries to actually be more proactive, engage more actively in this area of industrial decarbonization. And I think that there is also some positive sign here. So it's still up for us to capture this opportunity. Yeah, and maybe I will also mention this other part. So in the end, there are obviously several regulations on European level which are used directly, applied directly, but you also most of the law is actually needs to be transposed to the national
Yeah.
level. So if you have, I think good example would be permitting. So we already had acceleration of renewables investments in existing directive agreed upon a couple years ago. And the countries are struggling to do that. And we now are discussing how to maybe accelerate this part, but also we already know that we'll need to also implement similar solutions to accelerate investments in industrial infrastructure. So in the end, it's the same challenge for very basic problems on administrative side for each country. How to adjust their procedures, how to design financing instruments to actually enable these investments. For instance, if you would like to produce green steel, you would need not only a green steel power industrial plant, but also you need good connections to energy infrastructure. If you have CCS plant, you need CO2 transport network. And if you look step by step, this is associated not only with financing, but also administrative process. And this is a lot of homework which needs to be done.
Yeah.
So, yeah, a challenge.
Yeah. Absolutely. Lots of different challenges that I've picked up there. And I wanted to come back a little bit to the institutional capacity one, because I think that's one that isn't talked about as much. We talk about financial capacity, we talk about countries with deep pockets overshadowing the ones in Central and Eastern Europe with narrower fiscal spaces. But when it comes to institutional capacity here, I wonder if we can also reflect on beyond the administrative side, being able to get fit for purpose regulations in place, good accelerated permitting processes. I wanted to also talk about policy coherence, because you're mentioning a lot of these cross-cutting elements when it comes to industrial transformation. We have various types of policies, which, at least from my experience in Romania and other countries, perhaps in Southeastern Europe, policy can be quite siloed, right?
Yes.
And when we talk about industrial decarbonization, industrial transformation, we're talking about, of course, climate policy. We're also talking industrial policy, competition policy, trade, even social policy when it comes to the jobs and the transformation of jobs and potential compensation of workers, because it is a big transformation that's needed. So I'm wondering if we can reflect a little bit your experience from Poland and perhaps other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. How do you see this changing? Do you see more coherence across policy dimensions nationally? And then perhaps we can jump for that and talk about coherence across countries and a bit of a regional approach.
Yes, so one of the topics which we work at the Reform Institute is actually governance, climate governance, also cross-cutting economic governance. And yes, indeed, what you're mentioning is that this very sectoral approach, very fragmented approach is a problem. But also, I think that it's an overall problem of how you implement forward-looking policies. So at least in Poland, but I think that it was also quite similar in many other Central and Eastern European countries, that for many years you had actually very little need for internal forward-looking planning, because you had this goal to join the European Union, you had this set of directives which you need to transpose, or funds which you need to utilize. So actually the capacity to develop domestic policy, or the need for that, was a bit limited. So you could have a very successful governments which just adjusted to what they need to do. They do their homework and move
Mm,
forward. As we are converging to this Western European levels of income, so you basically have this low-hanging fruits already captured, but in the previous years, uh, through increased incomes, through increased standards of living, increased investments. But then, if we want to continue growing, and we actually want to help Europe as a whole to actually accelerate, because we are now in this kind of situation, it actually becomes not enough to just transpose European directives, maybe sometimes a bit too late, maybe just wait until someone else does the whole thing and just copy it. Now you actually, with acceleration also of a transition to climate neutrality, with coupling of different sectors, you actually need to think about all the stuff in parallel. So you need to think about funding, you need to think about energy sector, you need to think about transition in gas infrastructure, for instance. You need to coordinate also industry decarbonization with all these other parts. You need to think about what your neighbor do.
mm,
So this type of complexity, and we observe it also in Poland, is sometimes like meets this older governance system, which are more focused on just delivering step by step. And indeed, the lack of this kind of actual forward-looking planning, because in many cases it looks just if the European Union asks you what's your plan, you just list the list of things which you are already doing. And
yeah.
then actually when you need to do something new, it's in response to some problem or from increased concerns from stakeholders when you have a crisis or when you see and it's really time to implement something. So you're very reactive and don't really have enough sufficient time to develop actually well thought regulations and well thought financing schemes. So it's kind of this very simple lack in planning, in allocation of administrative resources. When I'm discussing this in abstract, it seems very maybe silly or very abstract, but once again, but I think in the end, you also see that this kind of delays, which we also see on the national level, that there was planned reform of some given act, and then it's delayed
Mm,
because suddenly it turns out that you need to consult a much higher number of stakeholders than you
mm,
thought because it's much more complex, or because you suddenly see some conflict of interests which you need to manage, which you haven't thought
mm,
through before because you haven't thought that you should plan a 3-4 years ahead. So you're just reacting. So we had this type of discussions in industrial context, for instance, when it comes to better integrating industry with grid, so connecting renewables directly to industrial plants. And it
mhm,
turns out if you have a very old and inflexible tariff structure, which does not fully reflect the costs, if you just connect renewables directly to power industrial plants, you will have a lot of questions about how to share the costs and benefits of this stuff.
mm,
And this is very natural, but it's not something which you can discuss and settle within a week or two. Suddenly, you look at the need for a more systemic reform of tariffs, of financing of grids, of planning.
mm,
And I think that there's quite a lot of issues which are very similar to that. I think one more example would be CCS, where you,
mm,
once again, not dependent on what's happening only in your plant, you're also dependent on the whole framework around you. And
yeah.
I think as at least from what I know, how it looks in Poland and from what fragments I see from other sea countries, this is something which is a challenge. And this is something which in many cases differentiates us in a negative way compared to countries like Scandinavian countries or Netherlands and then Germany, for instance, or France, when they just get over this kind of hurdles, management hurdles, a year or two or three ahead of us,
Mm-hmm.
even though we could have identified the same things at the same time. And once again, financing, I agree that this is a problem. There is some limits, but actually, I think over the last few years, we have seen with recovery funds, we now see that in some cases it's actually difficult to implement to absorb the money if you don't
Mm,
already have a good projects. And to have good
absolutely.
projects, you need to have appropriate planning and frameworks in place
Mm,
to make these projects viable. So once
mm,
again, this comes back to the need for planning and not only investment but also reforms. But I actually see a good sign, which may be not always popular among policymakers on the national level, but indeed this increased stress of increased focus on reforms, on conditionalities of access to funds. It obviously does not make life any easier for ministries which manage funds, but there's quite a lot of logic here because if you don't adjust the regulatory environment, if you do not adjust the way in which the money is spent, then just throwing money in the system is not always useful. So once again, if you think about industrial decarbonization, you can just throw some money in grants for some marginal improvements of efficiency or just build one or two biomass boilers somewhere. Or you can think about, okay, how we can actually, for instance, support deep electrification of industry, or how we can set up maybe a backbone of CCS infrastructure
mm,
for more countries to regionally cooperate. Or you can set up carbon contracts for difference scheme, which in itself is quite difficult. And here I would note that there's also one new interesting development that the Commission starts to offer some of it as a service. So you have auctions as a service when you don't necessarily need to develop your own
mm,
procedure, but you just provide funds for the company, and these are distributed. This whole thing is managed by the Commission, which already has learned from its previous experiences with this type of auction. So you don't really need to start from scratch, which
mm.
is maybe potentially also an interesting way forward for, especially for maybe smaller countries where you have maybe two or three projects to be supported, and it doesn't really make sense for you to start to develop the whole system from the scratch just to administer two or three support decisions. So this was, once again, I'm still drifting away from financing towards this more planning, design,
Yeah.
policy designs thing. But in the end, I think that compared to buildings or power sector or transport, industry is suffering from this underinvestment in actually planning on government level, on infrastructure level. And this is a huge issue because industry really needs a lot of clean electricity, clean hydrogen, CO2 connections. So it really is a big part of the puzzle for the whole economy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I'd really like to return to that infrastructure point a little bit later on, but completely on the same wavelength when it comes to planning. And I'm starting to reflect as well on the risk of locking into inefficient solutions as a result of the fact that policy planning tends to be more crisis management than proactive development. So we have targets, for example, for developing CO2 storage in Romania, which are very high, the second highest in the EU by 2030, around 9 to 10 million tons of CO2
Mhm.
storage capacity, annual CO2 injection capacity to be developed. And we're currently running a project looking at the risk of delaying proper planning so much that before you know it, the deadline year is upon you, and you do not properly assess where it actually makes sense to do CCS, where it makes sense to get the CO2 from. And CCS is expensive, right? As are many other industrial decarbonization technologies. So the risk of locking in to potentially inefficient investments. And here I wanted to return a little bit to something you said earlier, which was about mapping where the solutions are going to be most cost effective. What sort of approach can we take to figure out where we can target solutions for industrial transformations that they make the most sense? Because I think we also have to be a little bit sensible that there are certain industries, certain facilities, certain geographies where the future competitiveness in a low carbon world is maybe a bit more under question than in other areas. So how do we figure out where is most efficient to target investments, bearing in mind that we're not just talking about the potential future competitiveness, but also socioeconomic impact, potential strategic autonomy. So areas that might not make pure sense from a purely competitive point of view might make sense when you start looking at the social implications of keeping industry and transforming industry in those regions, and also ensuring self-sufficiency for Europe as opposed to being dependent on global supply chains. So how can we approach this? I know it's a complex question, but I think it cuts a little bit into what you're talking about, the need for systemic planning and accounting for a lot of different aspects of industrial transformation.
Yes, indeed. So I think that yes, it's probably one of the most difficult questions. So the need to balance this or to account for potential reallocation also for industries. I think that, yeah, to some extent it will be also a bit of a political choice, how much you are going to accept like the higher costs of transition and decreased overall competitiveness, but at the same time to have some more time and more resources for local communities to adjust. I think that, and this is my personal opinion, that maybe one of the problems with especially in Western European countries is that maybe too much choices was, too much focus was on protecting existing locations, existing industries, and at the expense of emerging new industries, new locations. You can also see this in the ranking of biggest companies or approach to regulation. So you have largest companies in the world are in the US or in China, but especially in the US because they actually grew over the last 20, 25 years, 30 years. And we really have much more problem in the European Union with growing new than maintaining existing things. So if we have, my personal opinion is that if we have a choice between protecting existing things and supporting emergence of new efficient things, we should, and it's not clear which we should choose, we rather should correct towards existing things, to the new things, because our last 20, 30 years have shown that we have stagnated. And actually, if you want to achieve competitiveness, in the end, this means that over several decades, you need to make rather more choices towards increased productivity, relocation, and reskilling. Yes, also migration within countries and between countries for Europe, or the same goes for United States, where you have mobility of people within the country, which is, once again, it's not popular and it's not easy. But I think we shouldn't also pretend that you can just have exactly the same geographical concentration of every industry as it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. Especially that if you look at sectors which are less regulated, less planned, you already have a lot of restructuring already, a lot of relocation going on. For instance, with ICT technologies, they're already reshaping, and we're well past the point where they have reshaped a lot of geographies of jobs or sectoral structures of jobs. With that, I think that there are two useful principles. So one would be to have more regional or inter-country level. So basically to make sure that if we decide how to allocate resources, We don't go into a country by country size level or region by region level for specific sectors, but we have these mechanisms which basically allow us to be more productive as for Europe as a whole, because in the end, that means that we can also have more resources to distribute. And I actually believe that the CE region has a lot of potential here, especially in this higher value-added sectors. So, for instance, in Poland, I don't think that we're going to be a large producer of green hydrogen. And I think that actually subsidizing a very large volumes of green hydrogen to be produced inside Poland can be actually harmful for other industries and overall manufacturing base, because you are redirecting the resources, clean energy, for instance, from direct electrification, for instance, to green hydrogen production, which is very like narrowly used in some cases. So maybe I'm quite open to reallocating some of that. But at the same time, here in Poland, but also in many other CE countries, we have excellent manufacturing base, excellent base to produce clean tech. And also, I would say that even with the small energy intensive industries, it's not always you need to relocate the whole plant. You can relocate some part of value chain, or you can just build a connection. And I think that in the end, if you have a more competitive support schemes, which just provide support as a bonus, then you have companies to decide or to compete with each other to choose whether they're going to relocate or whether they're going to build connecting infrastructure to still produce, for instance, steel or cement in the same place as it was produced previously. And the more I hear the industries, in many cases, they say that it's easier for us just to bring the clean hydrogen or clean electricity to the place where already we have engineers, we have all the capacities, than to relocate the whole thing to their country. And my approach here would be just set up the process, a competitive process, and let's see how in the end it will balance each other. I think that we'll see some countries or some companies which will relocate more, some countries which will want to connect more to just bring resources to the old locations. And you will also see a new sectors emerging, new production emerging. I think that in Poland we had good examples with heat pumps, with batteries in other parts of the region and in Poland. So I don't think that CE should be afraid of change. We have been beneficiaries of the fact that there was change in Europe as such, and we actually contributed also to increase productivity on the European level. If you look at over the last 20, 25 years, one of the things which actually was a win-win for the economy as such, European economy as such, is actually integration of our manufacturing base with the Western European one, which obviously also caused a lot of stress on some of Western European industrial regions. But with that, I think that when it comes to CE, for us, it's quite natural that things change. And in times like this, it can be actually a positive sign. So we're more prepared. While at the same time, and this is like the second option, is that you need to provide support. You need to provide just transition measures. But once again, transition. So not necessarily just financing old stuff just to make sure that it's still there, but to provide resources which you can reinvest and which you can direct to new sectors, and to make people and companies just, even once again, we're coming back to planning, something which we already seen in Poland, but also I think in many other countries, when the governments repeatedly tells you, or the region, that's not going to change. For instance, coal mining is not going to go away, or this old industrial plant which uses old technology does not need to worry about itself.
Yeah.
So even a simple thing of admitting that there's will going to be change, that there will be challenge, but maybe we should work together to look how the plant can transition, or if we see that the technology is basically a dead end, it's better to say, okay, it's a dead end technology.
Yeah.
And better to say this today than in 10 years or 15 years, because people need time, people need resources to plan. But I think that time is the absolutely crucial resource. So if you block the adjustments on the regional level, on national level, on individual level, if you say to people, okay, everything is going to stay the same, they're wasting time.
Yeah.
And this is fundamentally unjust, unfair. And then if you think about how it works out in the end, it's also unjust and unfair to other people in the society, because in the end, it usually looks like that you have some kind of very simple redistribution where you just throw money at people. So you say nothing is going to change. Suddenly you have change, and you just throw money at people just to make them a bit less stressed out about the situation. So it's not fair, not just, not for people involved in the sectors, and it's not just for the rest of society who has to foot the bill. So it's just, once again, we're coming back to the issue of like a lot of these things are back to the governance about how you approached the transition. Are you open about it? Or are you delaying and you're saying that maybe it will figure itself out? And in case of industries compared to coal mining, for instance, I think that there's much more to be won if you start forward-looking planning, because in most cases, industries can actually change. So you can
Absolutely.
switch the technologies, yes. So it's not the same as coal mining, which it would be quite difficult to have it in the net zero economy, especially with coal CCS not being a viable option. But for most of our industrial plants, industrial clusters, you have much more flexibility if you start planning early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think going back to the issue of forward planning, that seems to be a recurring theme in our discussion. And I wanted to come back very shortly to something that you mentioned there, because I think being transparent about what is going to work, what isn't going to work, about the benefits of changing, of undergoing the transition, but also the challenges, the fact that it's not going to be simple, it is going to be a complex process, not going to be cheap. And I think that that is something that we need to see a little bit more of, because we're also starting to see more and more social backlash against this idea of transformation, of green. At least it's politically polarized, but there is, we perceive, in my personal opinion, is a risk for these crisis management type situations in which change suddenly needs to happen overnight. Will obviously risk a lot more pushback, and the trust in institutions, which in general is lower in Central and Eastern Europe, will just diminish as well. I just wanted to flag that I think transparency about the scale of the challenge is going to be very important.
I would actually say that when it comes to heavy industry itself, the scale of the challenge, paradoxically, is not that fundamental from the overall economic point of view. So from the whole economy point of view, transition in steelmaking or cement is actually not that big of a deal, because it's a small, relatively small part of the economy, which, for instance, translates in the fact that you can have green public procurement for roads, for vehicles, and it will increase your the green roads based on green cement or green steel going into the infrastructure would be like a couple percentage points more expensive than a standard road. So this is once again something which is, I think, quite special about the industrial transition, that you have a very strong price competition, very strong cost sensitivity on the level of producers. So when you sell their materials to their market, but at the same time, from the final consumer perspective, you don't really have that strong of an impact on the price. So you can get car produced from green materials, green metal, which will be only a few €100 more expensive, if at all, compared to standard car. So, and the same goes for buildings. So it's always the trick is to make sure that this carbon price signal or green premium is translated to consumers, final consumers who actually don't have, they probably won't even notice the difference because it will be very limited compared to overall price fluctuations. But from the perspective of producers themselves, if you have 30, 40, 50% more costly production compared to your competitors, this is a problem. Yeah, it's with international competition, we have so we can come back to this issue of CBAM. Does it work? How it's going to work in practice? And I think in this context, I think it's very welcome that Commission is shifting focus more to the demand side. So in public procurement, basically green standards in procurement. So making sure that we're kind of reversing the focus instead of only focusing on pushing by carbon pricing on the producer level. We're also starting to focus more on pull. And I think pull is easier and pull is more, it makes a lot of sense also for CE, given that we still have quite a lot of infrastructure investments to deliver. And we will get still quite a lot of cohesion funds. And it only makes a lot of sense to actually have this kind of additional conditionalities so that to promote this supplies of green materials within this procurement, which once again, I would say it's good for a region itself, because usually if you have this type of heavy industries, you provide this pool regionally. So it's more where there's higher chance that a new low carbon cement production will happen somewhere in the region rather than in the Iberian Peninsula to supply green public procurement in our part of Europe, which is once again something which is which requires you to plan, to take into account that you accept this few percentage points higher costs or less, a bit less projects delivered in the end, maybe 95, not 100, but in the way which actually allows you through this green public procurement downstream to strengthen and provide resources for your heavy industries to modernize upstream. And if the more we coordinate and the more we deploy this in Central and Eastern Europe, the easier it will be also for businesses here to actually plan for this, that they will be able to capture this green markup, green premium. So yeah, it's something which I think would benefit from similar approaches as we have when it comes to transport or energy infrastructure, which we had some success in coordinating. I think maybe that would be my final point in this spot. I think that in the end, we need European Union frameworks. So this kind of for us, which we can use as a kind of leverage for our own structured discussions in the region. I'm personally not a very big believer in setting up everything from scratch only on regional level. I think it's more useful to have, to have regional cooperation, or coordination, but to make sure that it's connected to this European-wide process. And we already have, and we will have more of this, like with infrastructure, like also new types of infrastructure, hydrogen, CCS, and so on. So yeah, maybe let's work together in the region, but let's do this within the European framework so that we are more efficient and we need to spend less time building everything from scratch.
Absolutely. Within the European framework, more regional coordination, because Central and Eastern Europe does have great potential to make a difference when it comes to this new industry that we're looking towards. The final thought that I think I wanted to reflect on before wrapping up here is building on your recent comments about regional coordination. We're obviously in the Polish presidency of the Council at the moment. What role do you see for the Polish presidency in driving forward both maybe a bit more of a regional approach, because Poland has emerged as a strong voice from Central and Eastern Europe, but this voice has been missing over the decades from discussions in Brussels. What role do you think Poland can play in driving forward a regional, efficient industrial transformation that's good for business, good for people, good for planet?
Yes, I think that we are already 2 months in the Polish presidency, and I think in the cycle, in the institutional cycle, we are more now in this kind of agenda setting stage, setting the plan for next few years, and I think it can be actually quite fortunate. So I think it would be useful for the Polish presidency to indeed present this kind of approach that European market or single market approach, European framework, which then supports regional and national cooperation, is a good thing. And I think that if you look at the experiences over the last few years with, for instance, public procurement or with subsidies, state aid for industries, we see that I think in the end, the European approach is also in the interest of countries of the region, because if everyone goes by themselves, we actually have less resources, less capacities to keep up compared to this more common approach, common institutions. So if we have signal and sufficient push from the Polish presidency into this kind of common approach, but also reminding our Western European colleagues that there's the whole part of Central Eastern Europe, which is also very important to be kept on the same pace of transition. It's once again a win-win situation. So yeah, strengthening European frameworks in a way which are inclusive for our region, so that we can actually access the funds, which we actually have a seat at the table, but the seat at the table is open, and but in the end, I think I always say that we need to start with ourselves. So the seat at the table is there, but in many cases we're just not interested in going there because it's not like something which is today. Yeah, it's something which is the discussion is about 2 or 3 or 4 years ahead. So I think it's like two-way street. So still keeping this European frameworks open and not fragmenting European framework to national level. And unfortunately, it's still the risk of happening is quite high. And at the same time, our member state governments, going into this discussion, showing up with our own willingness to coordinate, our own willingness to utilize this kind of cooperation. I think if you compare our coordination with, I think, for instance, what's happening with North Sea, with electricity, with hydrogen, with CCS, you can see that there's still a lot of work to do. Not to say that it's not happening. I think in Poland we have seen quite sufficient progress in looking into this regional and European perspective, but it's, I would say, kind of organic work to do. Year after year, you need to keep pace. You need to be in the new initiatives. You need to make sure that our region is in the maps as not as only periphery of this very well organized northwestern systems, for instance, but also that you take into account our own geographic specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great thought to end this podcast on. Central and Eastern Europe does have great potential, and industry is one of the areas where we can really see a transformation. To make it happen, we come back once again to the idea of forward planning. which needs to happen alongside regional coordination to make sure that we avoid a two-speed Europe and create win-win situations across the continent. Aleksander, thank you so much for this really insightful discussion. To our listeners, thank you for listening. If you want to find out more about this really interesting topic of industrial transformation, both Reform Institute and Energy Policy Group publish a lot on this topic, so feel free to check out our websites. Thank you very much, and until next time.